and 4 subjects with 2 years, 5 subjects with 3 years, and 10 subjects with 4 years of data. We've had more interest, and we, just because of bandwidth and funding, we haven't been able to collect more data, and I would love to brainstorm with people ideas of how to get around that. We have had 2 subjects pass away. One was 7, one was 8. One had epilepsy, and we think that it's a little bit unclear to me, but probably from that. One died due to combination of respiratory compromise and increased movements. It's really unclear from the descriptions, both from the parents and the chart. Although the bulk have been from the US, we have had a Spanish cohort as well as Romania, Italy, Argentina, and Switzerland. So unfortunately, I was hoping to have this chart updated, but that didn't make it in time, but the trends are the same. So the clinical characteristics all had hypotonia as an infant, of varying degrees. Most families said that all families said by the age of 6 months, if they weren't noticing it, their pediatrician was noticing it. At the time of assessment, all but one had some form of motor impairment. The one subject that scored normal on all of our tests had a DBS place some 10 years before and had continued to do well. 13 of the 52 have epilepsy, and I think that's a discertainment bias because kids who have epilepsy and GNAO1 typically are more sick. They have more hypotonia, they're more susceptible to infections, and so it's harder for them to travel. I think we saw an uptick in the number of kids with epilepsy when we did our virtual data collection, and so this is something that moving forward we've really put a lot of consideration to. And we define epilepsy in the standard term as having two or more unprovoked seizures separated in time and space. So, not having seizures just when sick, not having just 2 seizures in one day. Of those patients, 3 of them had historical epilepsy, but had not had seizures in many, many years and were off medications. And when I went through and characterized the types of the movement disorder, the vast majority of these children had a mix of dystonia and chorea. There's a few that I could only detect dystonia. Some of those had DBS. And then at the initial assessment, 4 only had hypotonia, although as some of those children have grown and developed skills, some of the dystonia and the chorea has emerged. Okay. And so I have been using the GMFCS score, which is Gross Motor Function Classification Scale. It's a scale that was developed for cerebral palsy, and let's just be clear, whether or not cerebral palsy is defined as a non-progressive motor disorder. So whether, it's a matter of semantics. A lot of us think that GNAO1 is somewhat separate, but oftentimes for families, I will say, cerebral palsy is what people know, right? So you just say, my child has cerebral palsy due to a genetic condition, right? And I think that helps people in the community understand what's going on. So on this scale, 1 is a kid walking around that the average person can't tell has cerebral palsy, and 5 is someone who has to rely on a wheelchair and cannot maintain sitting balance. So you can see that we actually have quite a spread throughout our cohort. Certainly majority, are 4s and 5s, meaning that they're in the wheelchair most of the time, but a substantial number of subjects that are higher functioning from a motor perspective. And as I pointed out at the last time, and that has been replicated by our colleagues in Spain, the level of the motor disability does not necessarily correlate with the abnormal movements. And what we really found is that it's really, the hypotonia is really what drives the overall motor impairment. But it's the abnormal movements that land the kids in the hospital. So it's a little bit of a dichotomy. So both are important, but don't necessarily always correlate with each other. Okay, so looking at the how these movements change over time, because that's been one of the biggest questions of and why we want to do a prospective study which is painstaking, right? Every year collecting more data, right? We want to know how this changes over time because there's been, especially early on, there's been suggestion that this was a neurodegenerative condition or something that got worse over time. And, you know, looking at the data, it's really not clear. I would say that going into this study, I really expected to see more significant, clear neurodegeneration getting worse over time. And we really did not see that consistently. The vast majority, and we'll get to this in a few other metrics, the vast majority of the kids didn't significantly change year to year. So the first, is there a pointer here? Or maybe I can use my ear. So I didn't go through the scales for you for sake of time. The gross motor function measure is just a measure of gross motor function. You know, sitting, walking, reaching, and it's a very detailed assessment done by trained physical therapists, and I think is a somewhat good measure for GNAO1 because it's one of the few things that does capture the breadth of motor function. So even if a child can only turn their head one direction, that scores a point, you know, as opposed to some of these other measures like the Burke-Van Marsden, like the, you know, abnormal involuntary movement scales, which have what I consider floor and ceiling effects, which means that you can, a lot of our kids might score the very worst on these scales, and even if they improve, their score does not change. So that's very problematic, right? And it's a huge problem in pediatric movement disorders in general, because a lot of these scales were developed for adults and then have been retroactively applied to children, but we use them because they're considered the gold standard and is what everybody expects. So the GMFM is a score of 88 measures. So on average, when I took year 3, and I should back up and say, this data I analyzed after talking with a statistician. I lumped together patients or subjects that had either 3 or 4 years of data, and I took the first 3 years. There was one subject that we had to exclude because on multiple attempts, we tried to examine her and she was asleep. But you can see the mean change was 1 point, which is not particularly clinically significant, right? There was some variation there, and some kids did actually improve and some got worse. The Burke-Van Marsden is the gold standard historically for evaluating dystonia. A mean change of 3.1, I saw, but you can see there's a huge variability. And because of this variability, I didn't really think that while a change of 3.1 could be clinically significant, I can't really say that has any meaning. The only thing that maybe might worsen over time is the involuntary movement score. And this was a surrogate for chorea, so the wiggly kind of movements. There was a trend towards being worse over time, but again, you see the standard deviation, so it varied widely and was not consistent. So now we're going to look at the Clinical Global Scale of Improvements. So this is called the CGI. This is the crudest of all crude measures, right? So it is literally a scale of no disease, mild disease, marked disease, or it's at mild, moderate, marked, severe, most severe, right? And it is simply the clinician's global impression and is the score that I make after I spend an hour with the child, talking with the family, how's the past year gone, looking at them, examining them, and say, I think they're a little bit better, I think they're a little bit worse. But It is used a lot in clinical trials, especially in situations where, there's not a great endpoint, right? Um, so the as you can see, like in the motor function, there was quite a broad range of from very mild disease to the most severe disease that we've encountered. The majority of children and young adults fell into the moderate to severe category, so right kind of in the middle. And when I looked at these patients with 3 to 4 years of data, 2 improved, 10 remained the same, and 2 worsened. So kind of going on the theme of there's not a significant trend towards neurodegeneration, at least overall in the population that we studied. Now, what we studied is a sample of all patients with GNAO1, and I already told you that I think there's some bias, right? I think there's both bias in we may not be seeing the sickest of the sick patients, and we also might not be seeing the very mild cases where there's not a motivation to come to these to participate and to come, travel and have all this assessment if, hey, I'm doing fine, right? So, in looking at these metrics, we knew going into the study that a lot of these metrics were going to be imperfect, right? But we felt like we had to look at what is the standard, right? And then evolve from there. So what we really found with the AIMS, which looked at Korea, is that we think that there was tremendous inaccuracy due to the variability of the symptoms, and all the parents know this. Like, the movements vary from moment to moment, time to, hour to hour, day to day, right? And so what you're really capturing is a snapshot, and actually I felt like my scoring got more accurate with the virtual assessments, because then I was spending like an hour, watching the physical therapy assessment, and so I was able to evaluate the abnormal movements in multiple different, in the home setting, but in multiple different, at rest and with action, et cetera, et cetera. The Burke-Van Marsden has really bad ceiling effects. The GMFM, it's good because it has no floor or ceiling effects, but it's very time intensive. It can take up to an hour to complete, and it has to have a trained physical therapist, so not terribly practical for especially a bigger clinical trial. The modified Ashworth, which it's a very crude measure of spasticity. It's a good answer. Does the kid have spasticity or not? And that's really all it answers, and it cannot be done virtually. The Peabody, which is a kind of well-used, well-validated measure of development that's used, both in assessing normal children and, children with disorders. We really did not feel like it was a good measure at all, and we scrapped it after the first year, in part because it was very rigid. It's very rigid in how you assess children, which is good in keeping things consistent, but it did not account for adaptations that children had developed, which we think is important, right? Because we want to look at function and abilities and have a way to track that. And so didn't have time to include these slides, but our OT, Karen Balk, has worked on coming up with an adapted version of this, and we may be contacting some of you families to bring this to your therapy sessions and see if we can validate this fine motor assessment. And then we use the CP Child as a measure of quality of life. However, when you really look at the scale, it really is mostly about caregiver burden. And okay, sometimes caregiver burden doesn't improve. So in trying to improve that, we have been looking at more quantitative measures that we can do in the home environment. So this work was piloted by a master's student in engineering, Evie, who's been recruited away by Medtronic. We went into this with hoping with the notion of trying to quantitate the abnormal movements. And our hypothesis was that the kids with GNA were going to move less, but that their movements were going to be more jerky, and there were going to be qualities that we could pull out. And so right here, you'll see right versus left, age-matched control versus a child with GNA1. You can see that the movements, while the magnitude of the movements in GNA1 can be higher, the overall movement is more in the control subject, and it's grouped together. So you can see, you can really define, oh, the kid was playing on the playground here, and then was sitting in class, and then was playing again here, walking, going to the bathroom, right? And you really don't see that in the child with GNA1. And so then when we look at some more, to me, interesting markers, so I'm gonna just briefly look at this. So what we found is that total movement time was less, but the magnitude or the acceleration, which I expected to be higher in GNA1, was actually much less. And this was true in all the kids that we did. However, the jerk, which is the third derivative of movement over time, or the derivative of magnitude, is way higher in GNA1, meaning that the change in acceleration is higher, and the variance of the frequency of the movement is much, much higher, meaning that the movements are less coordinated and less smooth. And then what we did is, as a kind of negative control, we said, well, is there any difference between left and right? Which we didn't expect any difference. And sure enough, we didn't find any difference, and it's the same as typically developing children. So I just wanted to take 1 minute to address this question that I had a lot from people about DBS. So there's this dichotomy of, experiences in GNAO with DBS. Some people have said that it's a lifesaver, and other people have not had good experience, and there have been children who have died after having DBS, okay? So let's be clear, the dystonia rating scales often do not significantly improve, okay? The problem is, I think I've shown you that the existing rating scales aren't great, in that the rating scales really don't capture, meaningful what's going on at home. And that it's really the chorea and these dynamic movements that respond better to DBS than your fixed dystonia postures. So I think that's one reason that the rating scales don't change. And then some children have had progression of spasticity and fixed dystonia after DBS, even though their chorea and hyperkinetic movements are controlled. My counterpoint is that I firmly believe that many of these children would not still be alive. So even though they've had progression of their spasticity and fixed dystonia, they're still alive. They're still enjoying life. And that's something to be said for that. And when their DBS fails, oftentimes they end up in the ICU. And this is what I'm talking about. So this is one of the subjects in our study.
Oh, it's shrinking now, okay.
So we're collecting data for another DBS study, trying to understand the local field potentials in relationship to the movement. So here we just turned it off, okay, to record, and you can see her dystonia and chorea is getting worse. She's getting more and more uncomfortable. You can clearly see she's not happy, right? And this actually progresses to the point that we had to stop the recordings because she almost fell off the table, and she was just clearly in so much discomfort that I couldn't, I couldn't go on with it. And so, as you'll see here soon, we turn it back on, and this is what she looks like. So within 10 seconds of turning it back on. So clearly, even though she has had progression of her spasticity and dystonia, the DBS is still working, and when her battery failed, she ended up in the ICU. So that is the nuance that I want people to take away from it, and I also want people to realize that there needs to be balanced expectations. This is not going to work as well as it works in other genetic dystonias. There can be progression of symptoms. That doesn't mean it doesn't work. Yeah, okay. So, well, we're going to end there. I think I've made all my conclusions.
All right, thank you to Dr. Viehover. Do we have any very quick questions before we move on to our next speaker? Is it? Yeah. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Viehover. Our next speaker, we're going to hear from the European group, Dr. Giovanna Zorzi from Milan, who will be telling us about the European Natural History Study and the search for novel biomarkers in GNAO1. So welcome, Dr. Zorzi.
Jet lag. Okay, so thanks very much. So first of all, let me thank the Bow Foundation, because really, it's really important to be researchers and family here meeting together. Is something that is really, really helpful, especially for the clinicians. So I would like to talk about our project that has been just started about the European Natural History Study and search for novel biomarkers in GNAO1 associated disorder. And before, I just want to spend a few words about what is the European Joint Programme on Rare Disease. This is a program from the European community that is aimed to help research on a rare disease. And actually, it brings together institutions from many countries, European and also outside Europe. And since 2019, there has been these annual calls for funding projects, and actually the last one was in 2033. There has been something like 80 projects. 27 were selected for a full proposal, and 13, including ours, has been funded by the European committees. So our project has just started on 1st of June. It will last 3 months, and it brings together many countries, European and extra-European, on this research about the natural history. So the previous speakers explained the reason why we need a registry for research on rare disease. It's always obvious, but GNAO1 is a rare disorder. We know that there are many phenotypes. There are many questions that we cannot answer about the progressions of the disease, symptoms, response to treatment. So the aim of the registry is really to bring together a lot of patients and actually trying to look more precisely into the disease course. The problem is that if you want to look into symptoms, we need to measure the symptoms. So the natural history studies are built with the aim to use clinical scales to measure the symptoms. And this is, as we heard, a problem because there is no perfect scales. And one possible aim is to use scales that are already there, but also to create new scales that can be really specific to measure symptoms for that disorder. So the project is made by partners that have been funded from the European Committee, and you see many of the researchers are here in the room. So Italy, Switzerland, France, Israel, Germany, and Turkey are the principal partner. But we will be able to collect also collaborators, which means people from other countries that are accepted to participate to the study, even if they didn't get any funding. And so there are some other sites in Italy. There are Amsterdam, there is Croatia, there is Spain. So actually we were able also to, and this was a major contribution from the Patients National Association, from Spain, from the Netherlands, and from Italy, who really helped a lot. And actually I have to say that they were the promoter of this project. So very briefly, the project has two main parts. There is the clinical part, which is aimed to get insights on the natural history, that is aimed to create a registry. and also that is aimed to get insights about the brain imaging. And then there is a second part, more basic, which is aimed to find biomarkers. What is biomarker? Biomarker can be a substance that we can find in, I don't know, plasma, urine, or CSF that hopefully will help us to characterize the disorder and to measure the progression and the response to treatment. If we are able to find the biomarker, we are able also to see if, you know, a drug treatment, for example, or another can be helpful. So biomarker are really essential. We hope to find a biomarker to characterize the disorder. So we are planning to enroll, so our ideally is to enroll something like 100 patients. We know that this is very high purpose, but I think realistic we will be able to enroll something between 60, 70, 80 patients, which is a lot for a rare disorder. The first part of the project is the natural history study. So we want to assess once a year for 3 years every patient with a lot of scales, aiming to get insights into the movement disorder, epilepsy, sleep, nutrition, quality of life. So a lot of aspects that are cognition, a lot of aspects that can give us a picture more with quantitative assessment. The second aim, which I think is very important, is to build up a registry. So, and Germany and Moritz Thiel is in charge of this. We will build a registry in which all this information will be there. And hopefully this registry will then be kept even after the end of the project in order to continue to get data from these patients. The third aim is to look more precisely into the brain MRI. It means that patients will undergo MRI, and these images will be then analyzed with the aim to see if there are some statistically significant difference in brain volume, in brain volumes of some particular region. And this, of course, will help us also, for example, for DBS and to improve the targeting for these surgical procedures. But what is really interesting is the part 2, the basic research project with the aim to find the biomarker. And we decided to have some different approach. So, for example, you see in the work package 5, this is what we say an on-target approach. It means that we want to collect, if possible, some CSF from patients. This CSF will be analyzed for the search for any substance. So this is what we call untargeted. There is no hypothesis. We want to measure this CSF substance and compare with the CSF control and see if we can find some particular substances that are in the GNAO1 patient. But also we decided to have a different approach, and a different approach looking for neuroinflammation in plasma of patients. Why this? First, because we know from clinical experience that GNAO1 patients are very sensitive to infections. You all know that infections can be the cause of dyskinetic crisis. You all know that when a child has infection, the clinical state worse. So we want to know if there is a biological reason for that. And it means that we will collect plasma, and in this plasma we will measure a lot of substances that are involved in neuroinflammation. The second reason why we choose this is because we know from the research that the gene is not only involved in signaling and the CMP process, but also in the immune response. So we want to see if with this approach we are able to find something. The second approach for the look of biomarker is to look at the microbiota. This is something that also the idea comes because unexpectedly the gene is very expressed not only in the brain but also in the gut. Okay, and there must be a reason for this. And also we know that in many neurodegenerative disease, a change in the microbiome is something that we see and is able to follow the progression of the disease. This part will be taken by Vladimir, so if you have a specific question, you can answer this. So this is the, another approach able to see if we are able to find something. I'm also finished because I just want to say two more things. First, I want to stress again the role of the Patients Association in our project, because really they did most of the work, and the Patients Association are always there to remind us that time is important and we really need to accelerate research in order to find answers. This is not easy. We know that we cannot predict the time, but I think if we are all here, is basically because of the Patients Association. And just one last slide. For our Italian Patient Association, we are able to provide a Fulbright scholarship for one researcher who can come to America from Italy and work on GNAO1. Fulbright is a very important scholarship, and thanks to our PAO, we are able to provide this for a young researcher. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Zorzi. I, for one, am wishing we could fast forward 4 years so I could hear all the results of your study already. It sounds so exciting. For families that are listening, can you talk a little bit about your recruitment process and how can families get involved in that aspect?
So you see the list of the, the numbers of the recruitment are based on the patients that every center has already in charge. Okay, so personally we are following some 10 to 15 patients, Rome and Spain and Germany. We have new diagnosis, and we have recently very new diagnosis, and the Patients Association will help us to recruit those patients and to ask them to participate to the project. I have to say that I found that all the families are really willing to participate. First, because this is a very clinical project. I mean, patients are normally seen by specialists for evaluating of the clinical status, so it's just a more accurate clinical evaluation, so it's nothing that is really different from the clinical practice. We normally do EEG, we normally do MRI, so actually this is something that belongs to the normal clinical practice. So I don't think the enrollment will be very difficult. It's true that all these tests takes some time, but I think it's a good opportunity also for us, the clinicians, to observe more carefully the patients. That normally we have no time, we don't do all these scales every time, but we are forced to do that because of the project. And also let me thank all these partners, that some of them are here, they accepted to participate without funding, because this is something that is very important. And I also especially thank Dario and Laura, because this is something that is very generous. We got funding, so it's easy for us, but all these partners will accept to participate just for the scientific purpose. So thank you.
Any burning questions from the audience or anything online? Well, I have a million other questions, but I think we want to move on to Juan Dario Ortigoza Escobar, our next speaker, who is from Barcelona, who's going to be telling us about the severity puzzle, unlocking insights into GNAO1 related disorders.
Okay, good morning to everyone, and thank you for the invitation. I will be skip some slide because we already learned about what is GNO, what is. I will present with the permission of the families some videos or photos, so it's not allowed to record this. We will talk about the GNO1 definition and phenotype. We will also talk about brief about the severity score, the mild forms, the dyskinetic crisis, and also a project of the excitatory inhibitory ratio measured by the video EEG, and also about the mortality. So we have heard that this GNAO1 disorder is characterized by a broad spectrum of epilepsy, intellectual disability, movement disorder, including this very interesting phenomenon called dyskinetic crisis, hypotonia, and also gastrostomy. This disorder was described in 2013 and is an ultra-rare disorder. Many of the data you will see here is of the article of Science Gonzalez that compile all the published cases until last year. So to understand what a GNL1 does, I find this cartoon very helpful. You can see here that there are receptors that, for example, for neurotransmitter dopamine, that are coupled with the G protein. The G protein is a heterotrimeric protein with alpha, beta, and gamma subunit. You will see in red what are measured in the laboratory, and I will show you some experiment made by Dr. Martemianov about this, and a score that resulted from that work. So the first part is the GPR signaling, and this is impaired in all patients. So this cannot help, is not helpful to differentiate mild to severe form. Then we have the tremor formation, and I will show you in a few minutes that this is the most important measure to differentiate mild to severe or moderate phenotype. And also there is a receptor interaction between the alpha subunit and another receptor. And all this can be measured by bioluminescence resonance energy transfer assays. So we have heard that patients have epilepsy. Erika Xin talked about that, about 53%. But also a 30% of these patients can have other type of seizure, not including developmental and epileptic encephalopathy. Around 82% of these patients have movement disorder. They can have all type of movement disorder and also this very interesting phenomena called dyskinetic crisis. And also, as Amy has explained, hypotonia is a very important component of this disorder because that leads to the impair of the gross motor function, leading to developmental delay, and also these children have apraxia of speech or language delay. So for what is coming with the new therapeutics and everything, I think that severity score is of paramount significance because that can help to categorize this patient, also to monitor treatment response, and also to enable a more personalized approach. So in help with all the Spanish patient and also with the lab of Dr. Martemianov, we have developed, I will show you, a severity score for this disorder based on the assessment of 16 patients during 3 years. You will see there the characteristic. I will skip this. So in this severity score, we include 5 aspects of this disorder that we consider are the most relevant, including epilepsy, movement disorder, the gross motor function, language, and also the use of gastrostomy. When we were doing this or developing this severity score, we know that epilepsy and movement disorder are more need more items or sub-items to assess, including, for example, frequency of seizure, the intensity of duration, and the damage that can cause to the patient, and also the use of anti-seizure medication. And all this work is also made by Hannah Dominguez Carral, which is an epileptologist and in our center. So we assigned 3 points to the epilepsy, 3 points to the movement disorder, 4 to the gross motor function, 2 to language, and 1 to feeding. And this is the final score that is very easy to apply in the consultation, the outpatient consultation, because you can have the score done with 5 or 6 questions. So I will show you a video of patient to show you this broad spectrum. You will see here a patient with a mild phenotype. You can see that he can walk. He has generalized dystonia. He can speak some words. This is a moderate phenotype. And she is now with DBS because she has a status dyskineticus last year, and this is a severe phenotype with severe hypotonia, dyskinetic crisis also on DBS, and some seizures. So I will present here the work of Kirill and Grant Lutland. So they analyzed these 4 measures in the lab for all the mutation we have in our cohort. As I told you, the GPR signaling in the graph D is affected in all patients, and you can see that the tremor formation, the one that are marked with the red arrows, are presented in the patient with this more moderate or severe phenotype. So this can help us to differentiate between the severity of the patient. And also when we perform the correlation on the clinical score and the tremor formation, we find a correlation between these 2 measures. But you can see here in this graphic that every mutation is different because it can affect in a different way of any of these 4 measures. So in summary, we saw that each variant or mutation has a unique profile on clinical and functional phenotype, that the severity score correlate with this tremor formation, and we get a nice severity score, but we know that we need to validate this in a larger cohort. For that, we have already started a validation program that it will include the patient of the project that Giovanna talked, and also we get to get 23 now other collaborators to help us with their patient to validate this cohort. And I will show you here the data we have of this severity score around 3 years. And what we see in this graphic is that a patient with mild, marked in green, moderate in yellow, and severe in red, that not usually that not grows from one type to other. So we think it's a good measure, and we think if when the therapy comes, we can see if it is work. We can see the variation to moving from, for example, an intermediate to a mild phenotype, or something like that. So we are also very interested in describing this mild phenotype. This is a work we have done with 2 patients, one from our Spanish cohort and one from the Italian, from Italy. And you will see a video of this patient because there are very interesting and very mild cases with one of the patients only have a mild dystonia in one feet, with some seizure, but not, you can see here the seizures. He's well controlled with valproic acid, and the other patient is more or less the same, but with different mutation. And you will see here also a video of this patient. He has autism spectrum disorder, but is doing well at school. and is well controlled with valproic acid. And you can see the left two with this mild dystonia, and that's all the movement disorder he have. So when we analyze, or Kirill analyzed this, also we were very happy that the trimer formation was not significantly different from the wild type, showing once again that this measure can help us to differentiate mild to more severe phenotypes. But we were not the first one to describe mild phenotype. There are two other articles describing this. One is from Dr. Weir, that he collected 24 patients. Some of them have an adolescent or adult onset dystonia, and around half of them also have some mild or intellectual disability. And you can see here videos from his cohort showing these mild phenotypes of adolescent and also adult patient. And also there is a very interesting case from the group of Galossi and Leusi and Martinelli that studied this 8-year-old boy. You will see the video also with a very mild GNAO1 phenotype. And they also performed some very nice functional study showing the haploinsufficiency of the gene. So one very interesting aspect that while we are waiting for treatment or gene therapy is that children are suffering from this very severe episode of this kinetic crisis and leading finally in some case to die. So we were very interested to describe the definition of this kinetic crisis, to describe the management, the triggers, and we were also surprised that before this effort, in literature there were at least 22 terms in English to describe this kinetic crisis. So we don't have the right name until this work. And you will see here a video of patients from Italy, France, and Spain, and France having this kinetic crisis. So this is now published and available for everyone who wants to read it. And in this work with 13 experts reviewed 19 statements about the dyskinetic crisis, and we ended up to the definition of the phenomena and also this very nice management table. But we also are aware that we probably don't know a lot of the home management and the patient and caregiver point of view. For that, we are launching a survey. I will show you in a minute. To know more about this aspect. So also another thing that we get into account is that not all drugs, for example, chloral hydrate is not available in Italy or France, and dexmedetomidine is only used in the United States but not usually while in Europe. So we see some difference of also in the management of the patient. So we to learn more about this kinetic crisis, we are launching this survey that will be available next week. It will be available in English, Spanish, French, Italy, and German. And is going to be about to explore the impact of this kinetic crisis. Also, I will show you some preliminary result of work we are doing with the help of the group of Netherlands that are helping us to analyze the video EEG. Video EEG are usually used in GNAO1 patients either for the diagnosis of epilepsy or the monitoring of EEG abnormalities. So in this work, we want to explore the excitatory inhibitory radio as a biomarker, another biomarker that can help us to understand more about the disorder. So in this work, we compare 12 GNAO1 patients with 13 A-matched control. And or that group analyzed these 4 categories: absolute power, relative power, the trend fluctuation analysis, and the functional excitatory inhibitory ratio of the EEG. And they found that GNAO1 patients have a higher delta absolute power than compared to control. Delta is opposed to alpha, so they have a higher delta but a lower alpha. And we found some correlation with the epilepsy severity and also with the gross motor function with this, and that was expected because a patient with a developmental epileptic encephalopathy is supposedly to have a more higher delta than a less affected GNO1 patient, and we have correlated. So this is going to be talked about more, but I think in the future we are going to classify patient not only by this severity score, but also by their response to zinc. I will skip this, and then in the meeting of June in Rome last year, Jane Yu is a mother of a GNO1 Italian patient. She keep the question because the parent also usually have some difficulties in understanding and accepting, in some cases, the deep brain stimulation. So to study more about this decision making of deep brain stimulation in GNO1, we also are going to perform a survey that is going also to be available next week. And also our patients are getting older. We have some patients that 2 patients that are now going to the adult neurology field. So at least in our country, it's imperative to make a good plan for transition. And for that, we want to study more about this with patient interview or adult patient, and also we are planning to do a consensus with some expert, and we are now doing some ethic committee paperwork and planning to recruit a patient and contact expert for October this year. And also, I want to announce this because the Family Now Research Grant 2024 from the Italy Family Association is going to found this biomarker project that is based on cell-free RNA. And in this project, we are going to, we already have the sample collected of 20 Spanish patients and 40 control, and we are going to analyze to see if there is a difference between, as Giovanna said, if we can find some biomarker that can also differentiate mild to severe form. I move to the conclusion, just to say that as I showed you, patients with GNAO1 show this clinical heterogeneity with mild or more dystonic phenotype, and other with a more severe and including dyskinetic crisis. That biological factors such as the tremor formation are associated with the GNO1 severity, and that patients are experiencing this mortality during the context of this kinetic crisis. And also, as I promised my patient, Maria, she published this book. It's a book about the GNO1 experience. It's a very nice book because the key message of this book is that you are not alone, and there are your family and your friends that can help us in your way through this disorder. And also I want to thank all the GNO1 Spanish Association with all the patients and the parents, all our study group, the Spanish one, and the dyskinetic, and also our international collaborator, and also the group of Kirill Martemianov and the group of Likenhager that are studying the video EEG. So thank you very much.
Well, that was an incredibly packed presentation with a huge amount of data. I imagine that there may be some families wondering how they get that book. Is there a way that that can be purchased?
I think I have the only copy in the United States
Oh,
now.
no.
But I think it's you can talk with the family association because this can be translated very easy and can be print and also can be to get some funding for some project. It's a very nice book. When I get this book at home, there were some tears of other person that read it. So it's even when you are not in the field, it's a very touching book.
Okay, so right now it's an ultra, ultra rare
Yes.
edition. Yes. Anybody have any questions? Yes.
Lola.
Just have a question as to, in the severity scale, do you find that the motor severity, epilepsy, and cognitive severity track together all the time, or do you see discrepancies there?
We have analyzed some data, and the only correlation we found now is that dystonia worsen with age, but it's not related to the severity score. Maybe it's related to contractures and other things. But usually, people, children who are in the severe group, they are there because they cannot speak. They are very severely motor impaired, and they have both epilepsy and movement disorders, including this kinetic crisis. So usually it's a pack of having everything in the severe part. Yeah.
I just want to know, how do we get the surveys? Like, are you gonna let the
We are going
associations
to
know?
pass a link because it's done by the ERN R&D, which is the European Reference Network for Rare Neurological Disease. They put this in a secure platform, which is EU Survey, and we will get a link, and you can have that link. We are going to distribute through patient associations.
One question from the internet is, will the DBS questionnaire be available for patients and families outside of Spain?
Yeah. We will try to reach as much as we can. Yeah.
Any other questions?
One last question.
Thanks for the presentation. Short question. Sorry for my ignorance, and if I missed it, maybe the cell-free RNA proposal you got granted. What is the hypothesis about the cell-free RNAs? What are you looking for actually? Is it like?
Well, we are doing what Giovanna called we don't know what we are going to find. Okay, so in this it's a very interesting project because in the cell-free RNA we can study around a lot of RNA. And we can study where this RNA came from the tissue. We can do ontology pathway also, and helpfully we are going to find one or two that are going to be biomarkers. See, we have done this before in PMM2. It's a glycosylation disorder. So we have done the same, and we have found one biomarker for that disorder. So hopefully we are going to replicate that in GNAO1.
All right, well, thank you again to Dr. Ortigoza, and it looks like we are on break till 10:40. So we'll see everyone back then. Thank you to all our morning speakers.
Thank you.
For those in the room, refreshments in the back alongside some coffee. We'll be
Recording
back at 10:40.
stopped.
Thanks.
Recording in progress.
All right, everybody. 20-minute break goes by fast when we all want to catch up, but let's try to stay on schedule and find our seats again. Where's Emily? Is she in the back? I was making sure.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to ask everyone to please find your seats. We're going to start the program again. Thank you.
Okay, let's get started so we can stay on task. We have so many more really exciting talks to hear. So our next speaker is Larissa Heidemann. She says that I'm probably butchering it, but it's okay, Heidemann, from the Netherlands, who is going to talk about automated home-based assessment of dystonia in children with GNAO1 syndrome.
All right. Thank you so much for the invitation. And as one of the newest members of this lovely community, I'm very excited to be presenting our study protocol of one of our projects. And since it's still ongoing, literally just started the inclusions, that's why I'm keeping it as a study protocol. So first of all, even though I know most of you are probably already expert on the topic, just to be sure we're all on the same page, dystonia is a movement disorder that is caused by intermittent or continuous muscle contractions, and it may lead to hyperkinetic, which means excessive movements, and or postural changes. And as you all know, is that different parts of the body can be affected, and particularly for children who have GNAO1 related disorder, we know that the dystonia presentation and severity can vary widely amongst children. So that's why, oh, it's blue. That's why our first question, what we're interested in, is how do we assess the severity then? And this has been mentioned already by previous presenters, so that's lovely. So I can keep it short, but currently what we do in practice is that we visually inspect these children and we use clinical rating scales, such as the BFM mentioned before, to classify severity of dystonia. And this can be done using standardized tasks, but that's not always necessarily the case. And it can be done by physicians or other trained healthcare employees. So to kind of understand our thought process behind this project, I think it's good to address some limitations of the way we do things now, even though it's well established, to understand the basis of the project. So I just want to highlight a few limitations. First of them being, it is a subjective measure, which means that it's based on my expertise, for instance, as a clinician, which may as well differ from my colleagues. Another thing that's been said before a few times is that sometimes it can be quite time-consuming depending on the clinical scale you use. What we also know in children who have dystonia, so that's also for children who have GNAO1 related dystonia, is that the severity and the way it's presented can vary amongst even within a short period of time. And we know that factors that can contribute to it can be, for instance, fatigue, can be pain, but even emotional stress. Another thing that we've noticed in clinical practice as well is that sometimes, which has been addressed already by Dr. Amy Viehoever, is that sometimes when we try to, let's say, quantify treatment effects, when we use these clinical skills to rate severity, we don't always see a significant improvement after a given treatment. But we do sometimes see this improvement when we use other scales that look at other domains of daily life. So that's why we wanted to find a new measure or one that's already out there, that does a job of looking at it more well-rounded when, for instance, we want to quantify treatment effects, but also look at disease progression. So this leads to the second question, which is what could be some new strategies? And I think it's always to look back to the past when we look at when we want to understand why we can do things better. So I just want to highlight a few studies. So I just cherry-picked them because of the time I have. I'm sorry, it's just going automatically if you're wondering why I keep tapping it. But one study done in 2006 by Sanger et al., he wanted to see if the data that's being collected by, I'm just going to pause it, if the data is collected by wearable sensors when looking at dystonic movements in children who have dystonia due to cerebral palsy, which is a different cause for dystonia. He wanted to see if the wearable sensors do a similar job in looking at and tracking dystonic movements. And just to put it a little bit bluntly, what this graph shows is that when trying to detect dystonic movements, the way that we look at dystonia and severity of dystonia by using a clinical scale, there seems to be a relation between the data collected by and picked up therefore by wearable sensors and the way that we classify and rate severity of dystonia. When we go a little bit more in time, and this is a study done by a former colleague of ours, he wanted to see if we could go a little bit further and not only look at the data collected by wearable sensors, but also at video data, so videos recorded by parents or caregivers. And he wanted to see if we put this all in a computer model that tries to predict severity of dystonia based on the way that we classify the severity of dystonia, if this model could actually accurately predict this. So this is kind of the basis for the recreation of our project, and we wanted to do a little bit more, but I'll get to that, what that actually means. And another thing, aside from trying to automate these assessments, because we're clinicians, we also want to see if it's actually feasible, because we ask a lot of caregivers to do this for us. So first of all, some basics. So what's the concept? How do we do this? We include children who have GNAO1 dystonia, but we're also including children who are typically developing, because we're interested in not only studying dystonic movements, but also non-dystonic movements to distinguish this accurately. We ask them to perform standardized tasks, which allows for us to clinically rate them. And we ask them to do this using a mobile application called the Modus at Home app. If you're interested in it, you can scan the QR code. It's actually an application we've developed at our movement laboratory. And the reason why we ask them to use this mobile application is because it allows for the collection of time-synchronized sensor and video data. And at the end, we ask them to also fill in a short survey so that we can assess feasibility. And we ask them to do this, the task at least once a day. And once they're done performing the task, we ask the caregivers to let the child wear the wearable sensors and just go around about their day as they usually would, so that we can also study their normal day-to-day movement. For now, it's a minimum of 5 days. We ask them to do this. It doesn't have to be consecutively. We do this. We discuss this with the parent while planning this. So then we get all this data, and what do we actually do with this? So this is the part where I'm going to discuss a little bit more the thing we want to do a little bit more than our colleagues did. So instead of just feeding the model all this data, we want to try and define this better by extracting features, so clinical features based on clinical characteristics we look for when we try to classify severity as dystonia. So for instance, this is a stick figure, which is a metric you can use to, let's say if you want to say something about the head deviation, you can look at the body angles, and you can say something about the amount of deviation there is. Another thing when you're looking at the sensor data is you can extract different features, and there's already been addressed a few by Dr. Viover as well. But let's say you want to say something about dystonic movements, you can extract a feature called smoothness, which tells us something about literally the smoothness of a movement. The same can be done for if you want to calculate dystonic tremor. So all these features we will calculate using specific metrics, and this will be fed into the computer model. So then the model has all this data, but it actually needs to understand what the data means and what to look for when it needs to classify severity of dystonia. So that's where we need a reference for. And to this day, our golden standard is the use of clinical rating scales. And for us, that's these two clinical rating scales. So we, as healthcare employees, will then rate the videos using these scales, and then the scores will be fed into the model so that the computer model knows what to look for and how to classify severity of dystonia. So, as I said in the beginning, because dystonia in children who have GNAO1 related dystonia, it can be very heterogeneous the way it presents. We therefore create prediction models for each child separately, because at this point in time, we're not at a stage yet where we feel like we can create general models for all the children, meaning you only use one model to classify every child. So back to clinical care, because why does it matter? I mean, it's interesting to me and to us as researchers, but what can be said for you? I think it's interesting because we're trying to refine a measure that's been known already, which also captured more than just the motor aspects that the clinical rating scales does. We also look at aspects of daily life and quality of life indirectly, and we hope that by refining this measure, we're ultimately optimizing treatment strategy and are better equipped to quantify, let's say, treatment effects over the course of time more optimally. And then also, I call it real life, real time data, but it's interesting because we're also, sometimes in clinics we only have a snapshot, so a short moment of time to look at children and assess them. And as you as parents may know, is that in a different environment, their dystonia can be different. So we hope by collecting this data, we get a more better representative image of dystonia and severity for each child independently. So I hope you could follow it, even though my slides were having their own blast. And I just want to give a big thanks to my supervisors. Oh, that's the next one, sorry. To my supervisors and all the partners and collaborators on this project. Thank you.
So that was a great talk. I could definitely see, the value in having patients wear that for the week before their clinic appointment and showing up, and the data comes and you can make your own assessment, and combining that as being helpful. Have you been using that clinically yet to help you?
Yeah, good question. So the project before me was a proof of concept, so just to try without standardized tasks to see if it's actually helpful in clinic. At this point, we're not using it because I'm using it for my project. But before that, we have tried it in clinics, and the families have found it very a nice contribution to the care because they feel as if they can, give more information than just by literally explaining what they've seen over the course of time. And also caregivers find it very nice because then they can look at the videos and actually get a good idea of how dystonia presented itself over the course of time, so to evaluate.
Yeah, I can imagine it gives them the language to understand what you see from your expert eyes, but to help explain. Yeah.
Exactly.
Other questions? Yeah. Oh, Amy.
Yeah.
Oh.
Hey, so
Yeah.
how did you, maybe I missed this when you were going through the slides, but how do you set up the video such that it gets quality and you can see all of the joints?
Yeah, good question. So looking at the previous studies that's been done by my colleagues, I, for my task, very precisely described just for now how to position the camera, but then again, because I asked them to do different tasks, if only a part of the body is displayed when they're doing, let's say, like a grasp an object project task, it's all right if I don't see the joints because I also include other tasks to do that. So I still have enough data to feed my model in the end.
Okay. But the video part is just kind of separate, and then when they're going about their day, you don't have the video, right? Or
yeah,
okay.
The video part is just for now to train the model.
Right. Okay. And so there's at the beginning you have them do a certain number of tasks,
Yeah.
and then okay, got it.
With the sensors, yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your study. I just was interested, my son's 23 with a severe cerebral palsy. He's having 3 monthly Botox. Is Botox considered any in the study? Are some of the children having Botox?
So at this point, we don't really make a distinguishment between what kind of treatment they have. So we take it into consideration. But it will be interesting to see if we can pick up subtle changes when they do get treatment. So for sure, that's something for the future. But for now, we don't really take that into consideration. Thank you.
Hi. So just as a parent, this is really interesting because when I observe these movements in my son, we as a parents have to distinguish, this is dystonia with chorea, or this is just dystonia, or is it just chorea? Because it looks like, and this is my experience, right? For whatever you had that video where it was flexors with dystonia and chorea, like this type of medication works. And yet if it's just chorea, then something else works. So for parents, like, I realize, at least in my case, I have to distinguish it and say, oh, this is that type of movement, so it only, then this works. And so it'd be I'm super curious how this pans out, and if we could in US take part in this study.
Well, I'd love to. And thank you, I'm very happy you addressed that, because that's also one of my interests is, especially I literally graduated last year as a physician, so when you study movement disorders, you study all these definitions, and then you go into clinical care and you're like, this is dystonia, and this isn't chorea. So I hope as well that, like, we collect now a lot of data, so I'm very aware of that. We're asking a lot of caregivers and parents, of just families in general right now, but this allows us to further study movements in children as well and see if we can maybe find features that can distinguish chorea for dystonia in the future as well. So yeah, thank you for that contribution.
I just had a question as
Oh,
to,
sorry,
is the intention that over time the child will be able to wear the accelerometer without the video?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So this, a similar project has been done in the field of adult neurology. So that's where I gained my experience mainly from, where they validated a particular app for them Parkinson's disease. It's a bigger group, so it's easier to do that. And eventually what it does is then these prediction models are, they learn just as you and I do. And so they're able to pick it up just by looking at the movements, or maybe not even like the features I tell them to look at, but then they learn other things to look at. So eventually that's my aim, yeah.
All right, thank you, Dr. Heidemann.
Thanks.
Okay, so next up we have Dr. Jennifer Friedman from Rady Children's in San Diego.
So thank you very much. I wanted to address quickly the parent who asked about chorea versus dystonia. I just wanted to say I've been doing movement disorders for decades, and I still have scratched my head at times. So it's not easy, and it's very, very difficult, even for people who are supposedly experts in this. So for my talk, I first want to thank the Bow Foundation for inviting me to speak here today, and for supporting our efforts to try to develop an individualized patient therapy for Levi, who is somewhere here in this room today. The therapy is called an antisense oligonucleotide therapy, and I will get to what that means as I go through the talk. Because we have a mixed group here today, I am going to start fairly basic. I hope that's okay, and spare some of the details for people who want to ask questions of me later. So just starting with some background, you all know that GNAO1 is an incredibly rare disorder. There's no real definition for what constitutes rare disorder, though the U.S. Orphan Drug Act defines a rare disorder as one that affects fewer than 200,000 people. And by those statistics, clearly GNAO1 is an ultra-rare or ultra-rare disorder. And as most of you know, those with ultra-rare disorders often struggle to find diagnoses, but thankfully genome sequencing has dropped in cost, and this has really accelerated the rate at which we're able to find diagnoses for patients. I don't really have any accurate number of how many patients have been diagnosed with GNAO1. A quick literature search shows that clearly there is exponential growth in interest and awareness of this condition, which is, of course, a good thing. But also, as many of you know, diagnosis really is the first step in a long journey, and though sequencing has really shortened the time to diagnosis, for many rare conditions, including GNAO, treatments have seemed far away. So some of the reasons that treatments take so long has to do with the really long and arduous process that one must go through to develop drugs. And these include the time from concept formation in the lab to implementation into clinical trials, and eventually, at least in the US, FDA approval, and elsewhere, other regulatory body approvals. And this can take immense amounts of time and money. These are some statistics from 2014 looking at costs in the US for development of a single drug. And as you can see, it's quite high. And in part, the process is so lengthy due to the need, at least historically, to treat each individual drug as a unique structure with unique impacts and unique side effects, to treat them as snowflakes, as if you will. And each of these aspects of every single drug needs to be evaluated independently, which is a very, very slow and inefficient process. But this is beginning to change. The genetic discoveries have enabled us to implement genetically targeted therapies where we can apply lessons that have been learned for therapies for one rare disorder to genetic therapies for other conditions, and thus speed up the process and improve the efficiency of the process. So utilizing just an analogy of making a tool set, it's a very inefficient process to develop tools with unique shapes for every single different purpose. A modular approach where there may be a standard base with different parts that each have a unique purpose but can be switched in and out to that single modular base is a much more efficient process. And similarly, utilizing a similar base for a drug and switching in and out different pieces that can impact different diseases is a much more efficient process for developing drugs, and one that we are able to now use with our genetic therapies. To go into a little bit more detail here, each drug has a portion that is responsible for the uptake, the distribution, and the safety, and a separate part, or sometimes intermixed part, that is responsible for the effector portion of that drug that impacts the biologic target. In most drugs, these aspects are linked and difficult to separate one from the other, and thus each drug is unique and can't easily be modified. The informational drugs, in contrast, and I'm sorry, I do have some problems with the slides, but I think you can read it. In the informational drugs, these parts are separable. And so we can use the modular approach by having a single part that is responsible for the uptake, distribution, and safety, and has been tested and established as safe and efficacious. And we can substitute in and out the portion of the drug that is responsible for the effectiveness or the biologic target. And this is the strategy that is used with the new genetic therapies, of which the antisense oligonucleotide therapies are perhaps the most mature example. And in order to help you understand how antisense oligonucleotide therapies work, I'd remind you of the process that happens for our DNA to provide the instructions for building the proteins in our body. DNA sends its message through mRNA to the machinery that produces the protein in our body. And the, sorry, we again have a little change there on my slide, but the antisense oligonucleotides interfere with that process by binding to the messenger RNA and interfering with how it works. And these ASOs can bind directly to specific genes and to specific areas of specific genes depending on what the disorder is and what the specific mutation is. And so you can see they can be very personalized, not only to a disease, but to a particular mutation, and are even further personalized to an individual patient with a particular mutation. These can work in a number of different ways. The decreased production of harmful proteins, as you see on the top, there's some white boxes covering some of the words, but they can also increase the production of beneficial proteins and modulate the RNA processing and production of modified proteins. Sorry, it's coming through now. The antisense oligonucleotide therapies need to be delivered by spinal tap or lumbar puncture in order to reach the brain as well as other parts of the nervous system. And though this is a pretty cumbersome process, there have really been some spectacular successes. The most notable of these is the development by Ionis Pharmaceuticals of nusinersen for spinal muscular atrophy, or SMA. This has had been, until recently, one of the most common causes of infant mortality in the US, and is a disorder that's characterized by progressive motor dysfunction and eventual death. The development of nusinersen has really transformed the trajectory of both motor function as well as life expectancy for these children. And it's been a blockbuster drug that many of you may have heard of. But the development for this drug took a decade and cost billions of dollars. And so what to do for the rare and ultra-rare disorders where the resources are not commensurate with those rare but not nearly as rare disorders. So I'll give you some examples. It looks like my slides have gotten a little bit distorted, but I think you can see here, this is a example of a single patient named Mila. She was diagnosed with Batten's disease, which is a disorder of progressive motor dysfunction, seizures, visual loss, and eventual death. And so her family approached Dr. Timothy Yu at Boston Children's Hospital, and he recognized the urgency of the situation and was able to develop a personalized, individualized antisense oligonucleotide just for her, called Millicin after her name. And he was able to do this in a year, which is tremendously remarkable, and took a lot of cooperation of the FDA in modifying some of their processes for drug approval. So Millicin was given to Mila, and she did have improvement of her seizures. And she did eventually pass away, so it was not completely effective. But nevertheless, this study and this development of this drug for Mila really transformed the landscape and opened up the doors for similar development of similar drugs for other patients with rare disorders. So there are a few examples here of some individualized treatment that have been developed and are underway. There are many, many more in process. And Ionis, the company that developed the nusinersen for SMA, has spun off a nonprofit foundation called NLORM, whose mission is to support the development of antisense oligonucleotides for individuals with rare disorders. And they've treated a number of patients. Thus far, there are a number of treatments ongoing. And it was with that hope that in 2021, we applied to NLORM for Levi with the hope that they would be able to develop an individualized, personalized medication for him and his mutation. Their process is ongoing, and the red arrow indicates where we are in that process. And as you can see, the process is long, but they are trying to develop a personalized ASO for Levi. The biology of Levi's mutation is complex, but at least in part, there is data to support that his particular mutation can impact and negatively impact the function of the normal GNAO1. And so with that in mind, the goal of our therapy is to develop an antisense oligonucleotide that knocks down or reduces the abnormal protein and allows the protein, the normal allele, to function on its own. And so while NLORM is doing their drug development, we are trying to prepare for how we are going to trial this medication for Levi. And this is where the Bow Foundation has been instrumental in supporting our efforts. And so, how do we know that a drug is working? And I think you've already heard from a lot of people today about defining outcomes and measures, and that's what we've really been struggling with on our side, not with GNAO1 as a whole, but with an individual patient who is quite unique, which provides even its own challenges. Knowledge of the natural history is key, and that's why the studies that are ongoing regarding natural history are so important, because they allow us to compare what we might expect to what actually happens. But as you've also heard, those studies are at their beginning, and in addition, the changes that occur are not don't take place quickly, and so are not necessarily suitable for measurements in a quick trial like we are a trial where we have to determine effectiveness quickly. So we needed to think a little bit harder about what measures we would use. Are the patient measures, observations the most important, or the physician measures, and what can we find that's quantifiable and easy to measure? And I've been really thrilled to hear this morning the work that everyone else has been doing, because I'm hoping some of you can help in what we've been doing and trying to figure out for Levi. And so we have been trying to find measures that are specific to Levi's needs, measurable, realistically obtainable in a short period of time, relevant to Levi and his family, and things that happen quickly. We've been using a mixture of physician and patient rating scales, some of the things that you've mentioned here, and are aware of many of the challenges of the existing scales. And have been focusing on the cognitive and motor realms. Levi's family has highlighted that communication and motor function are the top priorities. And we've been measuring baseline while we wait for the drug. My colleague, Dr. Natasha Ochkumov, who's been helping us with the cognitive assessments, which are a challenge in this group, was not able to be here today, but she did record a few slides, so I'm going to just let those slides run, where she highlights our evaluations of various assessments in other children, not Levi, but other children who are matched cognitively and motorically, so that we can see what what, if any, measures we can find that would be useful. Are we able to get volume? Oh, maybe it's going to go.
Hello, I
There
am
we go.
Dr. Natasha
Okay.
Akshumoff, professor in the UC San Diego Department of Pediatrics. The challenges we face in direct assessment of neurocognitive abilities in this patient population include limited upper body coordination and limited verbal communication skills. A traditional IQ test with children over the age of 4 or 5 is not appropriate for individuals with intellectual disability of this type because their scores will be at the floor. The Bailey scales provide information about early cognitive, language, and motor skill development. With children outside the age range of the Bailey, growth scale values can be used to track growth over time. There's been interest in using the iPad-based NIH toolbox to assess individuals with intellectual disability. We decided to conduct a small pilot study to assess feasibility of these measures. Note that only the picture vocabulary test proved to be most useful given the limitations of the patients that we tested. Dr. Aaron Catt at Northwestern University also generously shared the concept formation test that he and his colleagues are developing within the toolbox framework. I tested 3 volunteers, and here's what we found. The first patient is a 7-year-old boy with intellectual disability and cerebral palsy. He responded using the touch screen. On the NIH Toolbox Picture Vocabulary Test, the child is presented with 4 pictures, a word is said, and you point to the picture that matches the word. His score is at the 5th percentile for age. On the concept formation test, he obtained 94% correct. The second patient is a 23-year-old boy with cerebral palsy and intellectual disability. He's not able to use the touch screen, but he could verbalize his choice. On picture vocabulary, his score fell at the 1st percentile for age. On the concept formation test, he obtained 71 out of 71 correct, 100% correct. The third patient is an 8-year-old girl with cerebral palsy and intellectual disability. She was not able to use the touch screen or verbalize her responses. However, I pointed to each choice and she said yes, or she shook her head no, indicating her response. On picture vocabulary, her score fell in the average range, 58th percentile. And on concept formation, she obtained 68 out of 70 correct, 97% correct. It will be helpful to use change-sensitive scores and growth scale values to assess effects pre- and post-treatment. Unfortunately, we found ceiling effects using the concept formation test, and there are continued response modality concerns. Given the limitations that we face, researchers are developing tasks that may rely on eye movements for responses rather than using the touch screen.
Similar to our cognitive assessments, we've been working with our rehab medicine team to evaluate motor function in addition to the standardized scales that you've heard a bit about. And you've heard some of the challenges, so we wanted to examine some unique ways of measuring motor tone. Levi and a number of other children have a mixture of dystonia and increased tone in the limbs. And our group has been using a sensor glove to evaluate tone in their CP population, and we decided to try this with Levi. The way this is utilized is the examiner wears the glove with the sensors and repeatedly flexes and extends each limb, and the torque is measured and plotted over time. Levi's undergone a number of assessments so far, and I just show a couple of examples here to show change from one visit to the other. So ideally, we're looking for a stable baseline to establish a stable baseline before treatment. And as you can see, unfortunately, we're having some difficulty with stability, with some limbs showing increased tone, others decreased tone, and others staying about the same. Now, our measurements were confounded a bit by some treatments, surgeries that had to occur. As someone asked about Botox, that also needed to be given in between. And so we're hoping now, with a period of stability, to repeat these measurements more frequently to see if we can establish a stable baseline. We did also use a video-based assessment of joint movements to see if we could quantify a particular task, a reaching task. We were unable, unfortunately, to find a task that was doable and reproducible, and so we are still working on this. So as n-Lorem continues to work to develop the drug, we remain hopeful that they will be successful and will be able to identify a compound that Levi can trial. There's no guarantee that they will, and we are hopeful that even if they don't, that our attempts to develop some motor assessments and cognitive assessments applicable to either Levi or other GNAO1 patients will be helpful in the future. So we continue to work patient by patient to try to find effective therapies. And I'd like to thank the Bow Foundation, my collaborators who are helping us with our assessments, of course, n-Lorem for developing the drug, and mostly Levi and his family for taking this leap of faith and trusting us to work on the cutting edge of science to try to develop a therapy. So thank you very much. And any questions?
Thanks, Dr. Friedman. I think that's all we have time for right now, but I'm sure
Okay.
you'll be around for lunch if there are any questions.
Sorry if I went
No, no, you didn't. And thank you, Dr. Exine, for helping us moderate this morning's session. That was great. We're going to turn now Dr. Kirill Martineyev with the Martineyev Lab with the University of Florida is one of our scientific advisors as well on the Bow Foundation, and he's going to help us moderate the rest of this morning's session. So we'll invite you to kick us off.
All right. Let's get the science continuing going. We have a very exciting set of programs. We have 10 talks on the cutting edge of science from the leaders in this field. And what's going to be important is to keep the timing tight. So I'm going to be sitting right here, listening very intently to every word that you have to say. But when your time is up, you're going to see me stand up, and that is a signal that that's probably time to wrap up. Anyways, with this, it is my pleasure to invite Terry Hebert here from McGill University in Canada. And Terry has been studying G proteins for quite some time, and now is in this clinical space of the GO mutations and G beta mutations. And the title of his presentation is The Alpha and Beta Gamma of GNO Signaling.
Thank you very much, Kirill. I look forward to you not standing up. I wanted to thank the Bow Foundation, first of all, and for Emily for reaching out to me. And I think that we have a lot to talk to each other about. During the break, we were talking about alpha and beta gamma. Those of us who study G proteins don't ever think of them as separate proteins, right? We think of them as a unit. So you've been talking about the GNAO alpha, and you'll see from your families, you'll probably recognize your mutations, and a lot of it affects GTP binding and the activation of adenyl cyclase, for example, downstream effectors. But there's a bunch of them that cluster in an area that are important for interactions with their family members, the beta and gamma complex, right? And you're going to see all of the symptomologies that you've been talking about, the movement disorders, the epilepsy, even the gastrointestinal problems. Those come back in mutations of the protein that I study, the GNB1. So I'm going to switch over from talking about the alpha subunit to talking about the beta gamma subunit. But always keep in mind that I think they work as a unit, and I think that the beta gamma subunits are really critical for supporting and in some ways regulating the functions of the alpha subunits and vice versa. So maybe patients with GNB1 mutations have compromised G alpha function. Maybe patients with GNAO1 mutations have compromised G beta function. So I'm going to talk a bit about the beta gamma. Kirill sits in really between both worlds. He works on this disease, GNAO1. He also works on GNB1. And for a long time, he's been showing things that we've been seeing too, is that G beta gamma subunits, beyond their canonical effectors at the cell surface, they're found all over the cell, and they're doing different things in different places, right? So G beta gammas, we've shown over the course of many years is that they're involved in building GPCR signaling complexes, right? They're involved in getting the partners to talk to each other as they go through this journey from genes being turned into proteins and then moving those proteins out to the cell surface where they do their work. So what I'm going to tell you about maybe is how G beta gamma subunits do things beyond these established canonical roles that are important for trafficking. And I'll tell you a story about how they might even be important in the nucleus of different cells, acting as transcriptional regulators. So the GNB1 encephalopathy, very many of the same symptoms, right? Epilepsy, abnormal muscle tone, developmental delay, all of the things we've just heard about, right? And so if we look across the space, so this is a busy slide. I'm sorry, I have a lot of busy slides. The gold is the alpha subunit, right? So that's the one we've been talking about. The green is GNB1 or G beta, and then this silver one here is the obligate partner of the beta subunit, which is called G alpha. You can see that there's a bunch of mutations in G alpha or in G beta that affect its function. The blue ones here are ones that are germline, that children are born with or inherit from their parents. The red ones are somatic, and sometimes they occur spontaneously in adults, right? So in the germline ones, we see symptoms just like GNAO1. And in the somatic ones, we sometimes see their effects in cancers later in life. So the other thing we almost never talk about in the G beta, G alpha world is the gamma, right? The gammas are the ones that are most different in terms of physical structure. So we think that thinking about what the gammas are doing is going to be a critical area of work going forward, right? So, but I'm not going to do that today. I'm going to try to keep it relatively straightforward. The other thing that I will torture you with today is that I'm going to talk about aspects of G beta gamma signaling that aren't necessarily related to the nervous system, right? So I'm going to drag you into the world of the heart, where we identified a lot of the things that we see with G beta gamma. This kind of summarizes a lot of work that was done to show that the G beta gamma subunits themselves play a huge role in heart failure. And you can treat animals with angiotensin, which is a driver of something called cardiac fibrosis, and you can see that those animals will get fibrotic hearts, stiff hearts that don't function as well. And the cool thing that was found a few years ago is that, you know, when you drive hearts into failure, you see a lot of fibrosis, all of this pink here. But if you treat with a beta gamma inhibitor, you prevent that fibrosis from developing. So we were thinking about how to understand the role of GNB1 in cardiac fibrosis. And the way we do that in our world is to knock down the expression of the gene using something called small interfering RNA. And what we saw was a surprise to us is that when you treat with angiotensin, you get a fairly significant fibrotic response at 24 hours. But when you knock down G beta, that response is actually upregulated. So there's a lot more genes that get turned on in the absence of G beta 1 than in the presence of G beta 1, suggesting that GNB1 or G beta 1 is acting as a brake here, right? It alters the fibrotic response. And maybe it's a way for the cell to determine whether or not we want a fibrotic response, right? It says no, and then eventually it says yes. You could see the same thing at the protein level. when you knock down G beta, you see a lot more proteins being upregulated in the fibrotic in the heart or in cardiac fibroblasts, and you see a lot less proteins being turned off, right? So it looks like at both the gene and protein level, G beta 1 is acting as a brake. So this is where we started to get into this rabbit hole of G beta signaling, which kind of Kirill has been important in kind of defining the extent of how far down the rabbit hole goes. But everywhere you look in the cell, everywhere, you can find G beta gamma subunits. And the weirdest thing to us was we started to see them in the nucleus. And one of my students, a very long time ago, came into my office crying because she thought the experiment didn't work, because it showed that there's an interaction between G beta gamma and a nuclear protein. That's not right. And I said, well, maybe it's a control gone horribly wrong, or maybe it's something new. And so eventually we found, and others have found, like G beta gammas interact with a lot of different transcriptional regulators, right? So they're controlling gene expression in some way. And a few years ago, we found by accident that one of the things that G beta gamma interacts with is RNA polymerase, which is the main driver of the formation of RNA, of messenger RNAs, right? So that was an odd finding. And so we thought we would trace that down a bit and try to figure that out. And so we started to kind of do proteomic studies to kind of find the interactors for G beta gamma. And one of the things that we were surprised by was that there were a lot of things that are associated with the nucleus in that, right? Including things that shuttle other proteins into and out of the nucleus. So we thought, okay, here's a potential mechanism for how G beta gamma gets into the nucleus. What's it doing there? And then we started to ask, well, what is it doing there in response to canonical receptor stimulation? It turns out that, like, the interaction that we found with RNA polymerase is increased when you treat cells with angiotensin, right? You can see that 3 times or summarized here. So G beta gamma subunits, thought to be a cytosolic protein that lived mostly at the membrane, is somehow getting into the nucleus and interacting with a regulator of RNA production. If you block entry into the nucleus, you block that interaction. That was interesting too, right? You can block the uptake. And then the most exciting thing at the time for us was that you can actually pull down a protein from the nucleus and look for which genes it's sitting on. And so when we do that, where we either use to control siRNA or knock down G beta, you can see that, so under control conditions, a lot of genes, so this is all of the genes in the human genome, there's RNA polymerase sitting along the length of all of these genes. If you hit those cells with angiotensin, the number goes up. If you knock down G beta, you increase that number dramatically from control, and when you treat those cells with angiotensin, you get a lot more genes that have RNA pol 2 sitting on them. So we did that with G beta as well, and you can see that there's a cluster of genes where there's G beta actually interacting with the genes, right? And so this is all the genes. This is a global picture, but we could see that when we looked at individual genes as well, right? So G proteins, G beta gamma subunits are interacting with the systems that regulate the production of other genes and other proteins, right? So where did we go next? We wanted to figure out how G beta gamma got into the nucleus. We wanted to figure out if it interacted with some of its canonical partners there and other transcriptional factors. And we wanted to understand how to build that network outward. I won't tell you about any of that today, but we started thinking about it, and this is where I first heard of the Bow Foundation, is how to connect these findings back to G beta gamma, G alpha signaling, right? So we could show that all of the G proteins in the cells we were looking at interact with G beta in our screens. But weirdly, we also started to see, and this is another Kirill connection, because he was very interested in these proteins as well, a family of proteins called KCTD. So the idea here was that we were interested as a potential therapeutic in being able to toggle the levels of G beta gamma. So we wanted to understand how those levels were controlled. And it's been known for a while that a lot of these KCTD proteins are involved in controlling the levels of other proteins. So I won't torture you with this, but we see a bunch of different KCTDs, and we validated that with classic biochemical methods. But then we wanted to kind of look at this, what KCTD was doing to G beta. And it took 10 years for this study to come out. I have to say it took 10 years for the study with the gene expression to come out. But we finally got a structure of this large complex involving 5 KCTD proteins, 5 cullins, so these sort of adapters that target proteins for destruction, and then 5 G alpha or 5 G beta gamma subunits, right? And that's probably better shown in this little movie if it runs, and you get a sense of how intricate these machines are, right? This is a machine that is purpose built to control the levels of G beta gamma in a cell, and you can see that's a pretty cool little thing. Yeah, I guess pretty cool to me anyway. So what happens when you tinker with that interaction? So here we're actually looking at the formation of beta and gamma, and by using a technique called biomolecular fluorescence complementation. And you can see that when you knock down KCTD5, you increase the amount of G beta gamma in the cell. And you can rescue that by putting KCT back. You can do that in a knockout line here. Now we've knocked out KCTD5, and you can see that you get a lot more where is my guy here? You get a lot more G beta gamma being made, right? And then you can rescue that by putting back the wild type KCTD5, but not with 3 mutants that interfere with the beta gamma interaction. And the other thing we showed that in that knockout lines, you reduce the ubiquitination of proteins associated with beta gamma, right? Without KCTD5, there's no ubiquitination. So it's controlling the levels of G beta gamma. So what are the implications of that? So then we knocked out GNB1, right? And I only want you to focus on one thing, right? So the red means something goes up, the blue means something goes down. Look what happens to G alpha, GNO1 when you knock down G beta, right? It goes up dramatically in one cell line, okay? And that it was also modulated by knocking down different KCTD5s. So there's some relationship between the function, the levels of G beta, and the function and levels of other G protein partners that they interact with. It's all connected. And the last little thing was we also thought one of the things that we saw when we knocked out G beta gamma was the activity of a bunch of proteins called SMARCAs that are actually important in controlling access to genes, right? They allow genes to be accessed by the transcriptional machinery. That, when we knock out G beta, the activity of the SMARCA system goes up. And we can see that again in 2 different types of cells, that SMARCA4 is interacting with G beta. And so when we come back to that, when we knock down, this is now back in a different cell type, and you can see that, again, there are effects when you compare control to knocking down GNB1 in a primary cell. But they're different than the last cells, right? So it's cell-specific, it's G protein specific, and we thought this is, again, another way of showing that, that there's no way to separate out the effects of G beta gamma on G alpha, right? G beta gamma is doing things even independently of its role as a partner for G beta gamma by controlling the levels of G alphas in the cell. Same story with G betas and G gammas. So where do we go from here? We have a bunch of big questions that we still want to answer. We have all of these different GNB1 mutations. We want to test the effects of modulating their levels or the levels of KCD proteins on shaping the signaling landscape. That's why I think a lot of the effects that you see in your children are both common and distinct. It depends when the mutation happened, it depends where the mutation happens, and it depends which cell you actually look at, right? So we want to understand the broader impact of the 50 or so mutations in GNB1. We want to be able to target those things, right? So the last talk was really interesting because we were approached by a company who wants to build solutions one patient at a time to make a G beta gamma ASO that would actually rescue function by skipping, by exon skipping. We want to figure out the relationship between the G alpha subunits and mutations in GNB1, and now more recently mutations in G beta 2. And we're sort of switching to more a human relevance system by now taking making iPSCs, so induced pluripotent stem cells, from patients who have different forms of GNB1 mutations. So Carol didn't stand up. I did well. I have an amazing group. 10 years of work from these two guys to get us to the story in the nucleus, and 10 years of work from Darlene, Robert, and Dominic to get us to. I mean, I have a picture of Dominic with his small child on his back, and he's been with me so long that now he's on the back of his not so small child now. And then the three other people to thank were Jason Tanney, my colleague at McGill, Paul Clark, another colleague at McGill, and Gil Privé, who we did the structure with at the University of Toronto. And again, I thank you. The engagement of families, putting all the stakeholders in the room together is the best way to do this. So I'm quite happy to have been able to speak to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Terry, for this wonderful talk. We've got time for questions.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Terry, for this great presentation. I was just wondering, so you have a link for G-beta proteins to SMARCA. So have you also done the reverse, like knock down G-alpha and see whether G-beta levels go up or down?
Yeah, I'm going to reveal my prejudices here. I'm a G-beta gamma person, so I haven't tried to knock down the G-alpha. We've been thinking of G-beta as a kind of a central regulator of the whole signaling networks of the landscape for a while, but there's no way to avoid the relevance of your question, right? So we haven't tried yet to knock down any of the alpha subunits.
So you talked a little bit about how mutations in the system affect the heart. Do we know anything about it, how it affects the gut?
No. I think at the level of the basic biology, which we're kind of doing, I don't think we've done that, right? And I think that the window into that now is, in the last few years, my lab has invested a lot of time and treasure in being able to build a pipeline from patient to iPSCs to whatever cell we want. So we're not a gut lab, so we've been focusing on making cardiac cells, and more recently on cortical and dopaminergic neurons, and then even more recently, because grant reviewers told us to do this, to make kidney organoids, but we haven't done gut organoids. But just across the city from me is the guy that's going to get that question asked. So yes, we'd like to do it, but there's only so many things to focus on.
How about you? Any other questions? No, thank you so much, Terry.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Hart Makers. He comes to us from Leiden University Medical Center in Netherlands. And Hart is the expert in the stem cells and stem cell biology, and his talk is right as you see it on the screen, the effects of GNAO1 associated disorder variants on iPS-derived neural cells.
Okay, thank you, Kirill. I was just wondering whether some people have a rope here so we can tie Kirill down to his chair so he can't stand up. Because I hope I can do it within 20 minutes.
All you gotta do is stay on time.
Yes, Okay, thank you for the organization, for Stephen, Alice, and also Emily for inviting me here. It's always a pleasure to talk to such a varied audience. I think it's really great to hear all this new data, these recent advances in the GNAO1 field. And today I will discuss with you the effect of the genomic variants in neural cells. Okay, so we heard just from Terry as well that GNAO1 signaling is very complex signaling, and our lab has set up to identify the new disease or the mechanisms that underlie the disease. And since this is such a complex mechanism, I think it's a very big feat, you know, like it's going to be difficult, but we will get there. Eventually, we want to get to the therapeutics stage, and this is also confounded by the heterogeneity, as you heard about. And this, first we set out to investigate the heterogeneity in the global population of the GNAO1 patients. And this was published last year, and it has been flying a little bit under the radar because we had problems with human mutation and getting it indexed for PubMed. So I'm glad that Juan Dario already mentioned it here. So we did do a global inventory of all GNAO1 patients, and we came up with 282 reported patients. And here you see the heterogeneity in the symptoms, and more than 80%, as you've heard, of the patients have some movement disorder symptom, and more than 50% suffer from epilepsy, about which 60% of those have early onset epilepsy, as you've heard today as well. So if we look at all pathogenic or likely pathogenic variants in the G-alpha-O protein, you see that they are quite dispersed over the protein, except there's one desert in the middle, and that's the helical domain. So it's not the enzymatic domain, the GTPase domain. That's always, I should say, that the GTPase domain is always affected and not a helical domain in GNAO1 patients. And also you see a few hotspots there, which we have known, and those are important regions for the protein, like the P-loop and the switch regions, which are important for conversion from the GDP to the GTP situation. If we zoom further in on these hotspot regions, we see also there still heterogeneity. So some patients have only movement disorder, while others suffer from epilepsy and movement disorder, and while they are bearing the same genetic mutation. So we think that genetic background is really important. So this was published last year, and we try to keep up with all the variants that are published in the world. So right now, we have identified at least 408 small-scale genomic variants, and that doesn't mean that they're all pathogenic. So there are many benign variants, but in general, there are 408 small-scale variants in the GNAO1 gene. 116 variants are pathogenic or likely pathogenic, and so far we have in our database 309 patients identified. And all the genomic variants are deposited to the Leiden Open Variant Genome Database. So if you want to have a look at the different variants, you can have a look there. What came out from our inventory is that everybody talks about GNAO1 as one single gene, but actually the gene contains two isoforms, so GNAO1A and B. And these are just, let's see what we can do. So only the last two exons differ for both isoforms. And when you then look at the translated protein, they are very similar. They are exactly, they have exactly the same length, and they only differ in 20 amino acids. So we wondered, what is now the pathogenic variant? If we look at the number of variants found in these two discriminating exons, the GNAO1A two exons have 70 variants, whereas the GNAO1B variant exons have 132 exons. In contrast, we found 90 patients which have GNAO1 associated symptoms. 84 of these patients have the GNAO1A variant, whereas 6 patients have the GNAO1B variant. So suggesting that GNAO1A is more pathogenic than GNAO1B. if we look further into these 6 patients, 3 can be ruled out as GNAO1 as the cause, because the variants were inherited from the father or mother. So we think that GNAO1A is the predominant cause of the GNAO1 associated disorder. So we want to study the heterogeneity and the disease mechanisms underlying this disorder. So then you have to look into the genetic background, because we show that the genetic background is very important. So what you do there is you try to get cells from the patient, somatic cells, and you reprogram them into induced pluripotent stem cells, and then you want to differentiate them into the affected population of cells, in this case, the neurons. Then you have your GNAO1A model, and which you can test for to study the disease mechanisms and also to see whether therapeutics work. So we start out with some variants which were found in the Netherlands, and so these are the variants. The blue ones are the movement disorder variants, whereas the black ones are the DEE variants. And then recently we acquired some extra lines via the Bo Foundation and also from Israel. Importantly, because there's a genetic difference between these patients, you need to have the perfect control. And the perfect control in this case is to repair the mutation that is found in the patient. So basically, we correct the mutation and make the cells wild type again. So what we do then is to differentiate these induced pluripotent stem cells towards neuroprogenitor cells, which are an intermediate between the iPSC cell and the neurons. And then we want to study these neuroprogenitor cells. So first we want to see whether there were difference in transcriptomic profiles in these cells. But first you have to assess whether the purity of the cells is good, because you look at the whole population. So we did do PAX6 staining, which identifies the neuroprogenitor cells, and our criteria was like more than 90% of the cells should be PAX6 positive. So then we sequenced the whole transcriptome in these neuroprogenitor cells, and we had 40 million reads using Illumina high-seq sequencing. And then we did do a principal component analysis, which shows the variation. And this already shows you there's very little variation. So on the left we have experiment 2, on the right experiment 1. And here you see the numbers, I hope it's visible. All the genes in principal component on the x-axis only give you 0.8% of the variance. So there's more variation between the experiments than between the groups and the controls and the mutants. So on the green we have one pair of one set, and I should say this is a monozygotic twin set, where the isogenics cluster pretty closely, and here also there's isogenic control with the mutations that we introduced in this line. But there are some differences. So we compared all the movement disorder transcriptomics profiles to the DE transcriptomic profiles, and we didn't find any difference there. However, if we do it only for DE versus the controls, and then we do a pairwise comparison, we find 26 differentially expressed genes. There are a couple of genes, and then we did do an ingenuity pathway analysis, and what we find is that the glutamate receptor signaling, opioid receptor signaling, exon guidance, which have been also linked to G-alpha-O signaling, are affected, and also the Rho-GTPase signaling, which involves the actin cytoskeleton. So, although we have just a few outliers, it all makes sense. If we then do disorder classification, this is what we get. Everything is linked to seizure disorder and epilepsy, making sense. However, we are not interested in neuroprogenitor cells per se, because eventually the disease-causing cell is the neuron. So Next, we set out to differentiate these neuroprogenitor cells towards the cortical neurons. So that's the outer cells in your brain. And then we want to measure what's going on in these neurons, in these GNAO patient-derived neurons, using electrophysiology. And for that, we use multi-electrode arrays, where you have basically an electrode, and you glue your neurons on top of the electrode. And then when the neuron fires, you can measure the activity of the neurons. So you measure the activity, so the functionality, and also the excitability. So how often does a neuron fire? So we've done this for the DE variants, and what we see here, that there's basically spike frequency, so that's activity is very similar. The burst rate, so how often that you find multiple spikes within a short window of time, is also very similar. But we do find a difference in the burst duration. So once a neuron fires, the epileptic neurons, they fire shorter. So the bursts are shorter. Within the burst is higher. So they fire faster, but they stop earlier. That's basically what we find. So this is for the DE neurons. So what about movement disorder neurons? We look here at cortical neurons, so we didn't expect actually to find anything. But what we do find is that motor neurons, cortical neurons derived from these movement disorder patients, they have also alterations in their neurons, and that is that the spike frequency goes up. Burst rate is higher, and also the burst duration is higher, while the spiking frequency, so the activity per burst, is lower. So to summarize this is that we find differences between movement disorder neurons and DE neurons, and that movement disorder neurons have a longer burst, whereas the DE have shorter bursts, and the spike frequency per burst is lower in the movement disorder, whereas it's higher in the epileptic encephalopathy. So, and this is good news, because now we have basically a screening system to discriminate movement disorder defects from epileptic defects. So we were very excited about that, and currently we are testing the other variants to see whether we can reproduce this. Just to switch gears, so basically what people have been studying as well is the localization of the G-alpha-O proteins, and for that they incorporate the M-scarlet protein, so that's what we do, into the G-alpha-O protein to visualize it under a microscope. So we've done this for the different variants, and what we see here, and I talked about this last time, is that the G-alpha-O wild type is only located in the membrane, maybe a little bit in the cytoplasm as well, whereas the two DE variants, which are on the right, they are poorly expressed and you don't find anything on the membrane. If you co-express this with the wild type proteins, you see that the wild type in green is in the membrane for the mutants, but for the mutants, the DE mutants, it's not going to the membrane either. This is very nice. At least we were wondering why this is, and we wondered whether this is due to the overexpression system, and also this is in tumor lines. So you use HeLa lines or neuroblastoma lines, which is a superphysiological situation. Is that truly also what happens in the patient? So then we said to ourselves, okay, we don't want to overexpress these proteins. We just want to target this scarlet protein, this red fluorescent protein, into one of the copies of the GNAO1 gene. And we use, again, this 229 mutant, which is a DEA-associated mutant. So we have different copies. Every cell has two copies. So we have two lines, one line where the red fluorescence is targeted to the mutant allele, indicated by the asterisk here, and the other line where the scarlet is introduced into the wild type allele. So then we want to check what is the effect of the mutation on the localization in the endogenous situation. What we do find is that, again, as we've shown by the overexpression system, that in neural stem cells, the protein, the mutant protein, is lowly expressed in comparison to the wild-type protein. So this is where the wild-type allele was targeted, and this is where the mutant allele was targeted. But then what about the localization? What we find here, and I hope it's visible, is that the neural stem cells, we see the wild-type located to the membrane, but in contrast to the overexpression experiments, also the mutant is located to the membrane, which is contradictory to what we found in the tumor cell lines. So then we differentiated these cells, and this is really recent data, which I wanted to show you, towards neurons and see what's happening in those neurons. And this is what happens in the neurons. On the left, we have the wild-type allele targeted. We see pure membrane localization with some aggregates formation, but in the mutants, there's less membrane localization and there's more aggregate formation, indicating there are differences there. So now the next question is, what's the localization in neurons? Is this to the Golgi? Are they located to the lysosomes? What's going on there? But also this gives us a new handle, a new drug screening tool, because now we can test drugs and look at the localization of the mutant protein and also see at the effect of on the expression levels. However, you need to next is also to test the effect of the mutant protein. So is there a dominant negative effect? We want to study that. And for that, we also generated, so basically the two lines that we have, we repaired the mutant allele, or we made a homozygous mutant. So now we have the full set of targeted lines, IPS lines, which we can use to study the different questions that we have. This is a summary, but I think due to the time, and I don't want to Kirill have stand up here, I'm going to skip that. And these are the people that contributed in blue, the people from Leiden University, and I really have to thank the people that made this research possible. So that's the Dutch Foundation, GNAO1 Foundation, the For Wisdom Foundation, and also the Bow Foundation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Harry, for this very exciting findings. We've got time for questions.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I was curious, or I found it interesting, the distinction between the epilepsy and the movement disorder patients and the cortical neurons. And I wondered if you'd studied medium spiny neurons and if you'd expect to find maybe something opposite, just because presumably the cortical neurons are more involved with epilepsy, whereas the medium spiny might be more responsible for the movement.
Yeah, so these experiments are they are really time consuming. So we've been thinking of making spiny neurons, and then we skipped out from it. So, and especially now also, since we find a phenotype for the movement disorder, we want first to validate whether this is true and see how we can use that. Because what we know from other studies is that the effects that's seen in the patient are normally exaggerated in a dish. So it might be that the cortical neurons in a patient are normal, but that we find symptoms in a dish because they are out of their comfort zone. Yeah.
Hi. So we, together with Simone here and Alessandro Rosa from Italy, did the IPS-derived neuronal analysis using two independent patient-derived fibroblast lines having the mutations in the G203R position. And one phenotype which is consistently coming up is the defect in the neural rosette formation. I wonder whether this is specific to the G203R or whether you see it also with the mutations you have studied.
We think we see a difference there, although it's not as obvious as you guys have published. We think there's a difference in polarity. So we did do ZO staining. So ZO1 shows you the polarity of the neural rosette, which is kind of similar. We need to do quantitative analysis on that, but we think there are differences, and especially we think that the rosettes from the mutants, from all the different mutants, are more monolayer, and that the rosettes from the isogenic controls, they're more 3D formed. So we think there's a defect as well. Only right now we are more interested in the neurons, and we are not going to pursue that any further. Yes.
There's a question there.
Yeah.
In alternating hemiplegia of childhood, which is another disorder, which with dystonia and epilepsy in childhood, there's really beautiful evidence from Catherine Svoboda that there's accumulation and aggregation of the disease protein. It's kind of like those punctate spots. Could be very different, but you had a chance to look for beta subunits and gammas to see if they're getting properly handled in the Golgi and the ER and these beautifully differentiated cells.
Yes, no. You're absolutely right. And we think that those are indeed aggregates. We looked at Golgi, but it's not, we don't see a pure overlap with the Golgi. So it's more like cytoplasmic, and they are retained in cytoplasmic vesicles, aggregates. We haven't identified the organelle structures or what they are in, and that's our next task to do so. But indeed, the 229 and the 278, so the DE-associated variants, they are, according to Dolman, classified as group 4 variants, which are very unstable variants. They seem to form aggregates, and very similar aggregates. Yeah, and we don't know what's what, because also the next question then is like, how do these interfere with regular GLFO signaling, right? Because they don't get to the membrane. So is this indeed a neomorph, or is there something else to it? And to be honest, we don't know yet.
Well, I have a quick question. So when you look at the list of the differential expressed genes, you have at least 2 different mutant lines.
Yes.
Do these changes seem to be different, or are they the same that you pick up? I might have missed that.
So no, we find 26 common outliers. So that's a 229. So those are 3 lines. So one from a monozygotic twin, that's a 278 line, and one also the 229 line, which are classified as group 4. So those are the unstable variants, which give early onset epilepsy. And then we find 26 genes deregulated, and that's what I showed you. They are all linked to epilepsy, right? And yeah, we haven't analyzed all the genes yet. Yeah.
I think we should leave it there. There's a lot of questions.
All right.
I will sense of
I will
fact
be
we're-
in there for lunch.
Yeah, great.
And you can ask questions, right?
Speaking of lunch, lunch is ready. It's in the room where we just got in to register this morning. It's a buffet. Grab your food, bring it back in here. We'll have until 1 o'clock when we'll start the programming back up. So thanks very much for your attention this morning.
Recording stopped.